Good morning. Good morning. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you here this evening. We are glad to have this time to come together for Bible study. We are studying in this Wednesday night class, we are studying the life and epistles of the Apostle Paul. A lot of what we've talked about to date in this study has been about his travels, his missionary journeys, and so forth. And we are now at the point in the book of Acts where Paul has returned from his third missionary journey, and he's been arrested in Jerusalem. Actually, I don't know whether I would say he was arrested on trumped-up charges, or really, in reality, he was arrested with no charges at all. He never was formally charged. They never did bring any specific accusation against him, but he is in custody in Jerusalem. Remember, there was a plot to kill him in Jerusalem, and so they transported him to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea was the Roman capital, not Jerusalem, but up to the northwest on the seacoast. Caesarea Philippi was the Roman capital, and they transported him there basically because they found out that there was a plot against his life. And so his accusers, in chapter 24, Acts chapter 24, his accusers come before the Roman governor Felix at Caesarea to make charges against him. If you're looking at the study guide, we're on lesson 6, question 7. If you don't have that, just follow along with us in the book of Acts. We'll be spending all of our time here in Acts. And in chapter 24, it says that the Jewish accusers, those who are trying to get the Roman government to do something against Paul, they have an orator. Chapter 24, verse 1, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. Just as a side note, I think that the next couple of verses here are so classically political, politician-like. Verse 2, when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, Paul, saying, "Seeing that by thee, Felix, we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness." He was really trying to butter up the Roman governor. The Jews hated the Roman government, and they despised the fact that they were under the Roman rule. But he's a politician, and so he's just saying what he wants to say to get that guy on his side. And so he's going to bring certain charges against Paul. Verse 5, here's what they say. This is what Tertullus said about Paul. I'm in Acts 24, verse 5. "For we have found this man a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But the chief captain Lysias came upon us and with great violence took him away out of our hand." And so that's what they're saying about him. Remember when he was first arrested, they accused him of profaning the temple in Jerusalem. It wasn't true. He hadn't done that at all. But they despise him because, we'll see what he claims is their basis of despising him. But that's the situation we are in now. So the third missionary journey ends at Jerusalem. Paul is arrested. A threat is placed against his life. He's transported to Caesarea Philippi, and his accusers come from Jerusalem to Caesarea to make accusations before Felix, who is the Roman governor at the time. Okay, I think that gets us caught up, yeah. Josh.
All right, so the next question, 8, wants us to continue on there. So Acts 24, beginning at verse 10, I'll read quickly down to verse 21. It says, "Then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which were written in the law and the prophets. And we have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me, or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice that I cried, standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. And so the question just says, summarize Paul's reply. And so we just read through it there, but basically, I guess if I was going to summarize it, Paul just said that, it had been 12 days since he went to Jerusalem. And basically, how could all these things that they're saying I'm doing or have done, how could I have done all that in just a short period of time? I guess it was 5 days, that he would have had to do all of these things and just got everybody stirred up. So how could I have done that? He told them, yes, I believe in Jesus. I'm a follower of his. And then where are all the people that's going to accuse me? Shouldn't they be here to accuse me? And so Tertullus came and laid out this argument, really trying to butter up, as you said, the leader here, which was Felix. Paul just said, here's what happened. I couldn't have done all that, and then nobody's here to even testify against me.
Yeah, and he lays it mainly at his belief in a resurrection from the dead.
Yeah, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, I'm here because I believe what the prophets said concerning the Messiah. Yeah. And I believe that there'll be a resurrection of the dead, which the Sadducees denied. And so he says, these are the reasons why I'm here. But where are the people who are the people who supposedly know that I did something wrong? Where are the accusers who supposedly are witnesses of some bad thing that I've done? There aren't any.
I think it's interesting that he really didn't go about to make a huge, it is a defense, but he didn't really go about to say, well, I couldn't have done this because of X, Y, and Z. He just said, if I've done anything wrong, if anybody's seen that, let them come show me where I've done wrong. Yeah. And of course, there wasn't anybody.
And Roman law really required that sort of thing. Roman law had some safeguards for Roman citizens. And one of them would have been that you cannot be arrested without formal charges. Paul hasn't been formally charged, and there's not anybody here saying that we've got the goods on him. And so this whole business is unjust and illegal in regards to how they're treating Paul.
Yeah, I can't help but think about Jesus' situation when reading through this, because there's a lot of similarities there. There's no real charges, so they're trying to come up with some things, but they just don't have anything that holds water. But it's just because they hate him. They got hatred for him, and they want his life. So they got to kind of pretend like, oh, he's done all these things wrong, but there's no proof, there's no evidence, and so they're just trying to run through this whole situation and get to kill him.
I've got in my Bible, I've got marked verse 16 just for easy reference. Paul says here, and he's going to say it again before he's done explaining himself in the next couple of chapters. Verse 16, I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man. Paul argued that his basic rule of operation, if you will, was to have a clear conscience. It's not as clear here as it will be when we get over into chapter 26, but I've noted it here. Paul claims a clear conscience. He's going to make it a little clearer when he retells this in chapter 26. But of course, this is an argument that we need to be prepared to make, because so many people think as long as I have a clear conscience, everything's good. Paul had a clear conscience during the time that he was persecuting Christians, arresting Christians, having Christians put to death. He said, I was doing what I thought I should do. I had a clear conscience in the matter. So conscience is a valuable tool, but it's not the acid test. And we always point that out, that a clear conscience does not necessarily mean one is right.
Yeah, in Acts 23 and verse 1, he's kind of already said that I've lived in all good conscience before God.
Yeah. So he basically says it 3 times. In chapter 26, he makes it real clear.
Right.
Yeah, okay. All right, anybody got any other comments here? Wayne?
I've got, turns away.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a pretty good descriptive of what he says in verse 14, the way which they call the second, you serve God of our Father,
Yeah.
believing everything that is in accordance with the law.
Yeah.
And the prophets, I haven't been living contrary to the law.
Yeah.
And so he's basically saying the same thing that James was saying,
Yeah.
or was trying to get him to show the people.
Yeah. Yeah. So he lived under the traditions of the Jews personally. Of course, he didn't allow them to be bound, but he certainly wasn't a mover of sedition as he's charged. Thomas.
So when it says clear conscience, do you take it as saying, like, I've done nothing wrong to God in that way, or just saying I believe I've done nothing?
I think he means I believe, because just take a quick sneak peek over in chapter 26, verse 9. I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, and so forth. So that was wrong, but he thought it was right. And so, you can have a clear conscience. If you think you're doing right, your conscience can be clear, and you can be doing absolutely the wrong thing. And I think that's the way he was. I think Paul was just saying, my basic mode of operation is to try and keep a clear conscience. But he was wrong, even in that time.
So would you say for us today as Christians, should we do the exact same thing? Even that, of course, going back to the Bible, but would you say, keep...
I think you've got to keep a clear conscience. I think a basic rule that we should follow: never violate your conscience. Now, that's not the acid test. I mean, that's not the be-all, prove-all. But if Romans 14, the last verse of Romans chapter 14 says, if you violate your conscience, it's a sin. Romans 14:23 says, he that doubteth is damned if he eat, because he eateth not of faith, for whatsoever is not of faith is sin. So don't ever go against your conscience. But that still requires that the conscience be accurately, correctly trained. But so if my conscience right now, Romans 14 was talking about eating meats offered to idols. If my conscience says I can't eat that meat offered to idols, then I shouldn't eat the meat offered to idols. Now, Paul had already taught, 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 10, Paul had already taught, you can eat meat to idols, you cannot eat meat to idols. It doesn't matter. You're neither better nor worse if you eat or don't eat. So that truth was already out there, but there were still Christians who had a conscience against eating meats. And he said, don't violate your conscience. If that's your conscience, don't violate your conscience in that. So that's just a basic rule. We should never violate our conscience, but that does not necessarily mean that our conscience is fully informed. Yeah, Thomas.
Do you feel that we can train our conscience to, it's like, for example, right there for the meat, it's not wrong. Well, do you feel like you can train your conscience to eventually get to that point?
Oh, I think so. Conscience is a teachable thing, because there are people who, and you can unteach your conscience too. You can Paul uses the expression, you can sear your conscience. So you might have a conscience, but you violate it so many times, now your conscience doesn't bother you anymore. So the conscience is definitely a trainable thing, trainable or untrainable. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important too, not to go way off track, but Paul, before he was Paul, was Saul, and he, as a Jew, you got this man now that's coming and claiming to be the Son of God or equal with God. Well, I mean, that's blasphemy, if anybody else claims to do that. And so he was so zealous for the law and for the faith of his fathers that he wasn't going to stand for any of that. And so he persecuted these Christians that are following that way to the death. But then he found out that he was wrong in that, and this was the promised Messiah. And so then he totally embraced it wholeheartedly. So, it's just kind of interesting to see that whole picture. So his conscience was clear because he thought he was doing right. Then he understood, I was way wrong.
Way off.
Yeah, now I was killing these people that were following the same way that now I know to be right. And so, watching him do that 180 is really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So, we're just days into Paul's custody. He's only been, he says it was just, what does it say back there? Where does he say 12 days? You read it.
Yeah, it was toward the beginning there. Let me see.
Anyway, we're just days into
Verse 11.
Verse 11, yeah. 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And he's been in Caesarea for a week, most of a week. So we're only days into his custody. And right here, right now, it should end. This should be the end because there's no charge. There's no crime. There's no justification for keeping him in custody. He should be set loose right here, right? But he's not. And the next question says, why would Felix not release him? There at the end of, keep reading there at the end of chapter 24. Remember, let's keep reading verse 22. When Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, when Lysias, the chief captain, that's the guy who arrested him in Jerusalem, when Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. And he commanded a centurion to keep Paul, to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come to him. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. You know those verses, especially verse 25. As he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled. And he said, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I'll call for thee. Apparently, what we always say is there is no such convenient season. There's never a time. And we still say that today, and I think it's just a truth, basic truth. There's never a time when it will be easier to be a Christian than to not be a Christian. There's no convenient season. And so Felix had never found it. We won't find it either. Anybody looking for it is not going to find it. But the reason why there was a couple of reasons why he would not let Paul go. Should have let Paul go. In all justice and fairness, Paul would have been released right now. But notice, he hoped to get a bribe. Verse 26. He hoped that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. And then the other thing is in verse 27, he wanted to show the Jews a pleasure. In other words, I got to keep, as governor, I've got to keep these Jews pacified as much as possible. Because if there's an uprising, if there's any civil disturbance or anything, that's going to go against me. And my higher-ups in Rome are not going to be happy if they find out that there's trouble in Judea and I'm supposed to be keeping a lid on these things. And so he wanted to keep the Jewish leadership, the Jewish elites, he wanted to keep them happy. He wanted to show them a pleasure. But also he hoped to receive a bribe from Paul. He hoped that money should have been given. Now, why would he imagine that Paul would have had money to give him? Anybody?
Someone in jail,
People in jail usually don't have a lot of money. Wait. He's a Pharisee, and his background was probably a wealthy man, although we don't think he was wealthy at this point. We think he'd lost everything. Tom?
Also, I think the concept of Roman citizen. Remember back then, one of the
Arresting officer.
You know, I paid a lot of money to get my citizenship.
Yeah.
How'd you get it?
Yeah.
And and then he told me where he was from, and Tarsus was a fairly important city in that aspect of it. And
So-
the references that he had money, and then just how the whole Roman centurions and the guy in charge. You don't send 400 soldiers to guard somebody if they're just a common, what do you think, a common criminal. They probably had some statute.
So he comes from a background that might imply that he could at least get hands on money. I tell you one other thing that I want, Carol?
I wonder if he knew about the collection for the saints.
That's what I was going to say.
And wondered if he had.
He might have come with a pretty good sum of money at the end of his third missionary journey. He likely did come with a reasonable sum of money to help the needy saints in Jerusalem. And again, that was just days before when he had delivered up that money. And so maybe Felix heard, this guy's got some money behind him. I'm going to see if I can get some of that. So I was thinking the same thing, Carol. Tom?
Also, when he is allowed to talk, he goes through and he brings up the concept of more Roman law. When he tells it, the people that really should be here accusing me of this thing is these men from Asia that came down that the lawyer made reference to. He said, you've got people here that's making charges against me, but as a Roman, the people that really have that charge are supposed to come to me.
Yeah.
So, when he's talking, he also produces, a someone that has a intellectual and education.
Yeah, he's got it. He speaks as an educated man. He's knowledgeable, and he's knowledgeable of Roman law for sure. So for all those reasons, he probably, could have imagined Paul either had money or could get his hands on some money.
Yeah. All right, well, question number 10 is really a softball question. It says, who succeeded Felix as governor, according to Acts 24:27, and it tells us there that after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room. And so there's the answer. Felix was succeeded by Festus after 2 years.
Yeah. But now, did you notice that leap in time? We went from a matter of 12 days to now 2 years.
Right.
But remember, he's being held without formal charges. There's no charge been placed against him. Yeah. So one of the things I always try to remember is that this whole business is just completely unjust and unfair.
So in verse 22, it says Felix, so he heard what Paul had to say, and it says, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them, and then said, when Lysias, the chief captain, shall come down, I'll know the uttermost of your matter. And then he commanded a centurion to keep Paul, let him have liberty. They should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or coming to him. So he I think I know a little bit about this Jewish business. And so he we'll just settle this thing down. And I think he's really, I don't want to upset the Jews here. I need to figure out what's going on with him, so I'll hear him out. He just kind of stalled this whole thing. But yeah, you couldn't imagine that it would have lasted 2 years.
Yeah.
But yeah, he stalled it and brought it to a screeching halt, it seems like.
We think that the wheels of justice turn pretty slowly in our day and time.
Yeah.
Apparently, that's a concept of justice in general. The wheels of justice typically turn pretty slowly. Wade?
So you're talking about 2 years. Don't you think that's providential?
Well, I think it's going to work out providentially to get Paul to Rome. I mean, this is all working to that end. But it's like providence, like we often say about providence. You can't put your finger on it and say that's it. And Paul couldn't. In the midst of this, don't you think Paul would have been saying, "Man, I need out of here"? But
I don't think he would be saying that. I think Paul is doing things to prolong his time there.
you think so?
I think he's trying to teach.
He's definitely, every time he gets a chance, he tries to teach. He did it with Felix, and he's going to do it with Agrippa here in just a minute too. Yeah, Tom?
There's sort of an implied situation that these Jews are continuing to come to Festus. Well, sort of, why don't you let it go? Something along those lines, or continue bringing up charges. Have you decided yet? Have you decided yet?
So you're thinking during that 2 years, it would not have been the case that they're just in limbo.
Yeah,
But he was.
They come through in 2 years, this is going through here. I'm not hearing anything from these guys. It must have blown over.
Yeah. So they're keeping it on the front burner. Yeah. Wade?
I think Paul could just shut up. He could just stop speaking, and they would have said, okay, well, there's really nothing else to talk about. You're free to go on.
Yeah.
But he just kept on and kept on and kept on.
Now, I've never looked at it that way. I'll have to give some more consideration to the fact that he was purposely prolonging the I don't know. I got to think on that some more, Wade. I'm not sure I agree with you about that. By the way, we got our map up. Thanks, guys, back there. So here's Jerusalem on the map. And there's Caesarea, okay, right up here. So it's not very far. All of Judea was from Galilee to Judea was only about 75 miles. So from Jerusalem to Caesarea, 25 miles. It's not a terribly great distance there. But that's where they are right now. That's where Paul is being held. Now, so Felix is the original governor, holds Paul for 2 years. he vacates that position and it's turned over to Festus. And it's usually, sometimes it's hard to keep those names straight. Felix was the first. Festus was the one who came in and took his place afterwards. Here's a little memory help maybe. Felix, well, I was going to say, I try to remember the U, but the Felix has got an X in it, so that may not be a good help. But I usually remember Festus with the U as being the later one, the second governor. So notice in verse 1, chapter 25, verse 1, now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Why does it say he ascended to Jerusalem? That looks to me like he's going from north to south. I would say he went down to Jerusalem. That's what we ought to say. I'm going to go down to Birmingham. Right? That's what we say. How come he ascended to Jerusalem? Well, altitude. Jerusalem was set in the hills, right? So he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man if there be any wickedness in him. So I think like Tom was saying a minute ago, they have not forgotten this situation at all. The Jews haven't. And as soon as a new governor takes office, they try to inform him about Paul. Now, I've always wondered, this is 2 years after the initial arrest, and back in chapter 23, verse 21, there were 40 men that bound themselves with an oath that they would neither eat nor drink till they'd killed him. Wonder about those guys.
Imagine they had to give up that oath.
I think they must have broke that oath, don't you? So 2 years have passed, but they hadn't gotten over it. And so as soon as Festus comes into office, they said, we want you to bring him down here to Jerusalem. And again, the idea was if we can get him on the way or when we get him down here, we kill him. We're going to kill him. They've still got a terrible bloodlust for Paul, and they want to kill him. But Festus won't do that. He says, no, you come with me, and we'll go to Caesarea, and you can accuse him there.
It just strikes me as religious people being upset with somebody. Their goal wasn't to have a trial and convict him. Their goal was to kill him. We want him dead. And it's the same plot they had 2 years prior. You get him out here in the wide open, and we'll just go ahead and kill him.
It's pretty amazing the kind of violence that can be conducted in the name of religion.
I know.
I think Wayne experienced some of that when he was in Ghana with the Seventh-day Adventist people. You don't agree with me, I'm going to pop you right in the nose. Can you imagine that? That's a religious response.
Yeah, I know.
But it is so common in the world, and it's not a new thing. It goes way back here. Okay.
All right, so we'll pick up there in Acts 25, verse 6. I'll read to verse 12. It says, when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down into Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar shalt thou go. And so the question says, when Paul saw that he was not being treated fairly by Festus, what was his request? So more of the same is going on here. The Jews made these accusations against Paul, not real charges, though, that they couldn't prove. We already talked about that before. Same thing's going on here, saying that he desecrated the temple, that he was against the Jews, that he was against the law, against Caesar, and none of those things were true. They said he was a pest before, but they had no proof, and I think verse 7 is really important. All these grievous complaints against Paul they made, which they could not prove. And so I think that's really important. And, I don't think there was much investigation done prior to or after. Typically, if you're going to make a charge against somebody, I deal with that every day at work. Somebody makes a complaint about somebody. Where were you at? Who saw it? What happened? I need to know all the details, So if he desecrated the temple or did something against Caesar, well, who saw it? What did he say? What did he do? Where was he at? But there's none of that. They're just throwing stuff out. So the claim,
And again, Roman law would have required that. sort of thing.
and so there's no claim being substantiated. And so I think Paul is he's seeing the way this is going. I've got no charges against me. I'm still being held here. And so he said, well, I'm going to appeal to Caesar. That's where I ought to go. And so I appeal to Caesar.
Yeah. So again, notice verse 9. Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before? There wasn't any reason to take him to Jerusalem, but he saw that these Jews were particularly passionate about getting Paul to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Now, Paul knows what their real motive is.
It's already happened before.
Yeah. He knows that their intention is to kill him, and that's why he doesn't want to go. But again, Festus doing the same thing Felix did. Got to keep these Jews pacified. Because if there's trouble here, it's going to go against me with my Roman higher-ups. And so he wants to keep the peace. And so he says, well, Paul, on second thought, because he already denied it once. At first request, he said, no, you come to Caesarea with me. Now he wants, just days later, he wants Paul to go with him to Jerusalem because he wants to keep the Jews pacified. He can see that this is a big, big deal to them, and they're not going to be happy otherwise. What does a politician do? He's doing what politicians do, right? Got to keep them happy. Wait.
It doesn't say here, but I really believe that Paul's being led by the Spirit at this point. I think that the Spirit is telling him what he should be doing and when he should be going.
It's possible. We couldn't say. The text wouldn't allow us to say. But, Jesus had promised the apostles that when they're called before, magistrates and authorities, that it would be given them in that hour. Don't consider what you say. It'd be given you in that hour what you should say.
I think he said in a few chapters before, when Agnes came in, he talked about the man shall be bound, so there was some prophetic references to where he was going to go and where he was going to, what was going to happen to him. So I think Paul knows where he means to be.
All right, now there's really a key principle stated here in verse 11. A couple of key. If you mark in your margins, verse 11 needs to be marked. If I have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. What about capital punishment? That's always a hot potato when it comes up in religious circles. And a lot of, I think, misguided religious people oppose capital punishment. What does the Bible say about capital punishment? Here's the Apostle Paul. He says that if I have committed anything worthy of death, there are some things worthy of death. If I've committed any of those things, I refuse not to die. So if there was no, and I think there are other places we can make the argument for capital punishment. If there was no other place, this is the perfect place right here. Here's the inspired Apostle Paul says, there are some things that are worthy of death, and if I've committed any of those, I wouldn't refuse to die. That's capital punishment right there. But the other thing there in verse 11 that's significant is, and this is not the only time Paul ever did this, but he called upon and used the rights of his Roman citizenship. I appeal my case to Caesar. He had the right to do that as a Roman citizen. He could do that. He's doing that in order to keep from being taken to Jerusalem and murdered either on their way or when he gets there. He's calling upon his rights as a Roman citizen. I have rights. I'm a citizen. You can't do this. So I think there's a principle there for us. We have rights as citizens, And it's not wrong to use the rights that are granted to us as citizens. Paul clearly shows that principle here. Right?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
Where did capital punishment come from? God instituted it in Genesis 9 after Noah got off the ark.
Exactly.
Whosoever killed man or shed man's blood by man, his blood would be shed.
Exactly.
So God designed was just following God's teaching.
Exactly right. Thomas?
How come do you think Paul took this approach instead of taking the approach of what Jesus took? What's the difference?
So you mean in the case of Jesus, he just basically surrendered, didn't he? The prophecy about the Messiah had been as a sheep dumb before his shears, so opened he not his mouth, right? Jesus didn't even make a verbal defense. He made no effort to defend himself against the wrong that was being enacted against him. So I don't know if I have an answer to your question. Thomas's question is, why didn't Paul do what Jesus did and just surrender, submit? Huh? Well, Jesus was not a Roman citizen.
So, a lot of the things that you're also going through and using, Jesus didn't have that.
So that's one worthy point. Jesus wouldn't have been able to call upon the rights of Roman citizenship in the course of his mistreatment. Matt?
I think the answer lies in the will of God. The will of God was for Jesus to sacrifice himself there. And it was going to happen. There was no need for a defense because that was the will of God.
And it was.
The will of God is for him to go to Rome.
Yeah.
And we've already established that God had planned that. He gave prophecies of it.
Thank you.
That was going to happen. So it's the will of God.
I think you're right.
So the talking that Jesus did was when praying to his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Well, it's not possible. That's the will of God. So there's no point for me to speak up to any of the people and try to defend myself because God's already willed it and I understand it and he was going through with it.
Good. I think that's right. Eric?
So massive.
Yeah.
We said it long over.
Yeah. Okay. Wade?
I agree completely with what they're saying, but and then Acts chapter 23 and verse 11, it says, "But on the following night the Lord stood near him and said, Be courageous, for as you have testified the truth about me in Jerusalem, you must testify in Rome also."
Yeah.
So Paul knew where he was going.
Yeah. Paul, it had been revealed to him that this would end up in Rome. I think you're right. No doubt about that. Okay. So we're still in chapter 25. Festus has got a problem. Now, Festus's problem is the prisoner has appealed his case to Caesar. I don't know what his case is. He's appealed this judgment and these charges to Caesar. I don't know what to, if I'm sending him to Rome, I should at least send him along with some formal charges.
And if we've had him here for a couple of years,
It's going to look
with
kind of
no
bad
charges,
if we just send him and don't even have any formality involved in it. So that's the thing that he's up against. And we won't read all this, but another Roman official from another nearby Roman province is Agrippa. Now Agrippa, notice in verse 13, after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to salute Festus. Well, Festus is a new guy. We ought to go, politically, it'd be good to go up and say hi to him, Agrippa is a descendant of Herod the Great. He's in the Herod family. He's a Roman appointee over another nearby district, not over Judea, but over a nearby district. And so he just comes to pay his political niceties. Hello, how you doing? And so in verse 22, there's quite a bit of conversation here. Agrippa said to Festus, "I would also hear the man myself." And Festus says, "Tomorrow," said Festus, "thou shalt hear him." Festus is kind of glad because look at verse 26. He says, "I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord, Caesar. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before you, O King Agrippa, that after examination had, I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him." So there Festus explained, "Man, Agrippa, I'm glad you showed up. And I'm glad you're interested in this case, and I want you to hear this case because I got to come up with something here to send to Caesar. I'm supposed to send the prisoner. I don't know why I'm even sending him."
yeah, It's pretty bad.
Yeah,
Pretty
really
bad
bad.
situation.
So again, if you want to talk about the picture of injustice here, of course, the ultimate picture of total injustice is the case of Jesus. But this one's a pretty good case of injustice in regards to the way that Paul is being treated here. He's been held for a long time and never even been charged with any crime. So Festus is glad that Agrippa has come. All right.
All right, so the next question says, consider Acts chapter 26. It seems that as Paul spoke before Agrippa and others who had assembled, he had one goal in mind. What was that goal? So I don't want to read through the whole chapter 26, but if you kind of section off chapter 26 and verse 1, Agrippa said to Paul, "Thou art permitted to speak for thyself." So then Paul stretched forth his hand and answered for himself, and he started talking. He basically talked in the first little section about his early life, and then he talks about what happened whenever he became converted to Christianity. The Lord appeared to him, and then he talks about what happened after he became a Christian. So that's basically kind of the three sections of Acts 26. In verse 31 of Acts 26, it said, when they were gone, after Paul had stopped talking, when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, "This man doeth nothing worthy of death or of bonds." Then said Agrippa unto Festus, "This man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed unto Caesar."
Yeah.
So they listened to what all he had to say. I mean, and he just laid out from his perspective, what happened in his life, my early life, what happened when I became a Christian, what happened after I was converted. And then they started talking among themselves. We ain't heard anything wrong yet.
Yeah.
And so they're talking among themselves. There's nothing worthy of him even being in bonds, certainly not death. And so if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, then we'd have to let him go.
And that goes to what Wade was saying earlier.
Yeah.
The providence is sure coming together in this matter, isn't it? To get him to Rome. A couple of things there in chapter 26. And we already looked at this earlier, but I think it's worth noting and maybe marking in your margin. Verse 9 through 11, where Paul says, I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests. And when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. And I punished them off in every synagogue, compelled them to blaspheme. Being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto a strange city. Whereupon, as I went to Damascus with authority, and then he talks about the Lord appearing to him on the road to Damascus. So again, this I think is maybe the best passage where you think you're doing right. You know, a lot of people, well, it's just what I think. Well, Paul was doing what he thought too, right? But he was dead wrong. He was persecuting Christians and having them put to death. But he thought he was doing the right thing. So just what you think is not the proof, and a clear conscience is not the test. And Paul sure proves that. I know we've mentioned this before in verse 10. The King James says, when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. A lot of newer translations will say, when they were put to death, I gave my vote against them. And based upon that phrase right there is the phrase that causes lots of people to think that Paul was potentially, maybe even likely, a member of the Sanhedrin Council in Jerusalem, that he had a vote in such matters. Strongly implies that, at least. I don't know if you could prove that beyond all shadow of doubt, but there's certainly a strong implication that if he had a vote in such matters, he very possibly was a member of the Sanhedrin Council. All right, we're just out of time. Is that a good stopping point, Josh?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. We got a couple of, I want to comment about, the famous statement of Agrippa, almost thou persuadest me to Christian. We'll pick it up there next week. Thanks, everybody.